Hello. Um, so we are very excited to hear Neel today, and I just give a little bit of the background of how we ended up talking about the things we're going to talk about today. So, when we started planning for what play to read this month, Falguni came up with this idea that we should read a queer play because it's Pride Month, and Still and Still Moving came up as the play we'd like to read. And as we started reading the play, and questions of which have been, I'm guessing, around since Neel has written the play, that okay, so here is a queer play. Do we call it a queer play? Can we box it as a queer play? Should we read it with other queer plays? And what does it mean for a cis man or a cis straight man to write a queer play? And more broadly, what does it mean for us to write about the lives of people whose lives are different from our own for XYZ reasons? And so we had a lot of these questions in our minds when framing the conversation around this play, and then we had a conversation with Neel, and it was a really fun conversation in the sense that we got to talk about it in a different language, because I think that there is a particular language in which these questions are spoken about in our current political and artistic discourse, and I think we felt very much the need to try to change that language, or to try to talk about it in a different language, so that there was more room for us to unpack some of those very complicated questions, rather than pick sides and be like, okay, here is the side of the fence I stand on, and from this point I will speak whatever I speak. So based on all of this, the idea that really stood out for us was messiness and doubt, as being sort of essential to this process of writing the play for Neel, and also for us to be able to talk about and engage with the fundamental messiness of these questions itself. That's why the talk is titled Messiness and Doubt. And now I will pass it on to Neel, who I'm guessing all of you know. He's a Delhi based writer and theatre maker, and is with the Tadpole Repertory, but is currently in Y teaching a batch of DSM students. So, Neel, over to you. And how we'll do this is that Neel will make his opening statements. He has a few things he wants to speak about. So, that will be a big piece that we'll listen to. And then we can just open up the floor for conversation. And if it's okay, I will moderate that a bit to make sure that we stay on track and don't kind of waver onto too many messy territories. Okay. Yeah. So over to you, Neel.
Thanks, Apeksha and Falguni, and thank you to Bhasha Center for inviting me to speak and for picking Still and Still Moving as a text to launch this amazing program. I also want to thank not just everyone who's here today, but everyone who came yesterday and who read. And it was really wonderful to almost eavesdrop in a way on a reading of my play, to have no participation in it except to just be a listener, and to for lots of really sort of wonderful, lovely things to happen. The key one being, of course, that Still and Still Moving, the production which I've directed, is a play with a cast of 13 men. And so rehearsals and shows are always like very testosterone driven. There's like, there's no, and yesterday to hear the play read, I would say predominantly by women and female readers, was really beautiful, and it just, the play sounded very different and it had a different energy. Okay, so I wanted to talk about a few things that came out of the discussion that Falguni and Vivek and Apeksha and I had about the context of this play and the writing of this play, and how this play exists in as a contemporary play and in the various frames of politics that it occupies. So Still and Still Moving was written across 2010 to 2000, late 2011. That was the period that it was written in. And it came out of a workshop called Writer's Block. And Writer's Block essentially is a workshop that is jointly conducted by the Royal Court Theatre, which is a theatre based in the UK, in London, which is a writer's theatre. I mean, they're a theatre that devotes a lot of energy and their work and attention to playwrights. And a Mumbai-based theatre group called Rage. They are the people who facilitate and organize this workshop. And the workshop essentially invited 14 Indian playwrights to go on a residency and then work. We worked with 3 mentors who came from the Royal Court Theatre. So essentially, British mentors who came and were facilitating this process, which was a group process, but all of us were writing individual plays. And the reason I feel this is important is because at that point, many of us were very young writers, and so the opportunity was obviously something quite fantastic for us, not just to work with such a famous theatre that is a playwrights theatre, but also to work and be a part of a community of fellow playwrights. And just before I get into the point that I want to make about that experience, I have to say that overall the experience was really wonderful, primarily because we were writing in a community. And so we read each other's plays, we challenged each other, and we became very close-knit as a group. But one of the strange things that happened at Writer's Block was on the very first day, I think, that we were working, the mentors brought out this whiteboard, and they started asking the writers individually to talk about what they thought were key contentious political and social issues in India. And within like 20 minutes to half an hour, the board really got full up with a list that I think that all of us can imagine. So from globalization, industrialization, caste politics, religious politics, and there was this huge board filled with like these kind of issues. And then the Royal Court mentors very proudly stood in front of the board and said, these are your plays. These are where your plays will come from. And all of us writers very politely nodded and like, And then later on, we all confessed to each other that we felt really strange and weird about this situation where we were being told in this really bizarrely post-colonial way by white British people, what the issues of India were. And I say this with all kind of love and respect for those writers because they're wonderful people. But I think that the setup and the framing of this exercise was just totally awkward. And out of that exercise, many of us started to then think of ideas. And the first play that I wanted to write had almost nothing to do with this kind of issue-based politics. It was like a murder story. And so I wrote a scene and then I pitched it to everybody. And I was told in in no uncertain terms that this is not the kind of play you should write in this workshop. It essentially has nothing to do with India and why are you writing this? And so I very dejectedly went back, and then I wrote another scene, which ended up being one of the scenes in Still and Still Moving. And for those of you who read the play yesterday, it's basically the scene after Adil's birthday, when Partho comes in and they kind of have conversation. There's a lot of awkwardness between them. And everybody loved this scene because it really majorly ticked one of the issues on the board, which was sexuality. And I spent a little more time investigating this idea. And I found that, okay, actually, really what I wanted to do was I wanted to write a love story. And the reason I wanted to write a love story is because I felt that theater especially, but also film to an extent, my experience of reading, watching love stories in these mediums was that there was too much neatness to it. There was too much of a predictable kind of arc to how things move, whether they end as tragedies or whether they end as in that kind of happily ever after mode. Love stories had this very sort of certain formula, and which they kind of very rarely wavered from. And I reflected a lot on that myself, and uh, found that my own experience of love and relationships and negotiating desire was not this. It was not, it didn't move in this kind of clean trajectory. And I found that there was a lot of messiness. I mean, I kind of, I thought to myself that the messiness and untidiness of love, and the fact that it has no structure, it doesn't follow any sense of logic. Like, you think you're moving forward with somebody, and then suddenly you've taken two steps behind, and and I thought that I hadn't really seen that kind. I mean, novels have the ability to do that because they're expansive, but films and theaters, I think, didn't really capture that messiness. And so that is what I committed myself to doing, to writing a sort of untidy love story. And again, I was told by my mentors that you aren't following the act structure. You are, your play is very fragmented. It's more cinematic than it is theatrical, and but I kind of was trying to resist that, because I was trying to create something that, at least in its experience, had that sort of slightly jagged, illogical, and sometimes broken kind of structure that I felt like relationships have. And so the primary sort of prerogative, or the primary goal with Still Moving, was to achieve this, was to write a love story. And the fact that the two protagonists were two men was, of course, very crucial. This was 2010 in Delhi, and it was kind of around the time that a lot of conversation around 377, and first the initial High Court judgment, and then the repeal of that judgment. All of this was very active, like the pulse of queer politics in universities and in artistic circles, and was very active. But to me, that was not, I think, what I was responding to. And here is where I come to another aspect of writer's block, is many of the writers there did write political plays. So people wrote about Kashmir, people wrote about tribal politics, people wrote about gender violence. But it seemed like a lot of that came from the privilege and opportunity of being playwrights able to work in that structure in a workshop. And I think that that was not lost on anybody. And also in 2010 and 11, when this workshop happened, there wasn't so much of a culture where I think writers were being interrogated on their identity, and what kind of legitimized their voice in the telling of a particular story. So much so that during the writing of Still Moving, a few people kind of may have commented, and you may have brought it up in conversation, that it's interesting that you are writing this play, being a kind of heterosexual man. But it was never like a sort of a subject of debate. And in fact, I was telling Apeksha and everybody else that a lot of friends of mine who were part of the queer community would joke when they would ask me, and I said, "Oh, what are you doing now?" I said, "I'm working on this play," and they were like, "Oh, is that the gay play that you're writing?" And it was not meant as any kind of barb. It was like genuinely so. Neel, who works in the theater, is writing a play, which is a gay love story. And even through this, carried on through the two productions that I did of Still Moving. One was in 2012, one was in 2014. So there wasn't really this kind of, I didn't feel the scrutiny. And I think personally at that time, I may have taken this to be like, okay, there is some acceptance for the play because people have watched the play and they see it in a certain light, or they kind of identify with it. And so this isn't being made a big deal. And I wasn't actually thinking so much about the fact that as a male director with a certain kind of experience, actually, I mean, I've had the privilege of actually being able to do this exercise without being scrutinized so much at that period of time. It would be, I think it would be quite different in 2022. And there was also an interesting transition that I was going through as a playwright at this time, which was that when I started writing in my mid-20s, I was very certain that as a playwright, I should write from what I know and from my experience. So a lot of my early plays, and I took that really literally. So a lot of my early plays are about people who work in the theater, who are actors. So I really zoned in on the world that was around me. And Still and Still Moving was one of the first plays that kind of went a little out there. And that's because I think that by that time, 5 years into working in the theater actively, I started to realize that I was kind of full of doubt, and doubt about what the role of writing was and the role of theater was and what the role of kind of artistic representation was, and doubt about politics itself, whether it's kind of gender politics or sexual politics, or how to frame my own experience into the space of fiction. And I think that doubt has become a very bad word, I think, in the 21st century. People, because we are so much, and I include everybody. I mean, I don't mean to say that a certain kind of people does it. I think all of us are so much more prone to statement rather than question. And part of that has to do with the modes of communication that we have, social media, texting, and all of that. And also because of the kind of easy sort of the velocity, let's say, of communication that we kind of occupy, that we're always kind of talking at each other, saying things at each other, and asserting our position. And so when somebody expresses doubt, it's almost seen as something weak or something kind of unformed. And to me, that is why it is exactly the space of art and fiction and storytelling. Because the process of writing and making a play then, to me, becomes the sort of internal exploration of that doubt for yourself, for your kind of peers, your actors, and the audience themselves. And this, I realize, is a very uncomfortable thing. People want to know. I think, as in general, people want to know what your play is about, what it stands for, what it's kind of trying to say. And when you express that actually it's just asking questions and it's not really, there's no full stop at the end of it, people get really disconcerted. And I think that I've noticed this a lot, and which is why, in some kind of perverse way, I want to engage with it even more. Like, I want to ask more questions. And I think that with Still and Still Moving, I don't really find, even when I listened to the play yesterday, I don't really find the place trying to say anything definitive, I think the play is just trying to kind of talk about the experience of love. And this becomes complicated when somebody kind of says, yes, but what do you know of kind of a queer relationship or queer love? And this question I find fascinating, because I think on the one level, when we talk about some of the dialogue of queer activism is love, right? Like, queer love is not kind of why is queer love? This whole thing of the law of 377 was that it was acts against the order of nature. And so that really bizarre thing. So essentially, the law was about kind of not about love itself, but it was about the sexual act. But at the same time, the inverse of this is that question that I spoke about earlier, that what do you know about this identity? And the truth is, and to be really completely frank, I don't see the relationship between Partho and Adil as simply just a queer love story. because there are many, when we talk about realities and lived realities, there are multiple realities there. There's the reality that they're from different places, like Adil is from a small town and Partho is an urban kind of sort of educated man. They're of different ages. They live in different parts of the city. There are different stages in their lives. Partho has lived life as a kind of in a traditional heterosexual setup, whereas Adil has grown up very much more comfortable with his queerness. And so there are all of these kind of sort of lines in between them. And I think the play is trying to sort of navigate all those lines, because all of those lines are then part of the messiness of which I was talking about earlier. And it may be a bit naive, but a lot of the ambition of the play initially was, can we make this play that is a love story between two men and perform it in kind of not niche spaces in the city, but in kind of theaters, and have people see it primarily as a love story and then kind of engage with the politics of it. But not to come into it saying, oh, this is that queer play, or this is that gay play. And then kind of the play is constantly framed by that reality. And the last thing that I'll say before we open it up is, even within the space of a love story and the setting of Still and Still Moving, the politics are multiple, because even when you're looking at a queer love story, you're also looking, for example, at homosociality. So that's why Delhi plays a big part in the play. A lot of the metro scenes, only some of which are actually in the script, there are many more in the actual stage production, are between men who kind of occupy intimate spaces in the city. And the metro just becomes one example of that. And it's men occupying intimate spaces. And these are not all homosexual men. They are men who occupy intimate spaces. They are men who engage in different kinds of intimacies. And the other part to this is the play also has to then confront homophobia, which means that everybody making the play and writing the play and performing in the play also have to do that. And when I did the play the second time, there was a cast, as I said, there was a cast of 13 men, and many of them young, sort of just out of college students. And they had to actually kind of deal with this question. And so did I. I mean, a lot of, for example, in the play, the Partho's son, Rishi, has a very sort of uncertain and is still navigating his own kind of relationship with an experience of homosexuality, like whether it's his roommate who he thinks might be gay, or how he sees the kind of the way people behave in the metro and how he kind of speaks about it. And I sort of identified a lot with that uncertainty, and being that kind of having that uncertainty as a teenager and as a college student at a time when I knew that many of my friends were not open. There was and so that is something that I had to sort of truthfully investigate in the play. And we talked a lot about it while we were making the play, because the idea that everybody working on a queer love story is on the same level in terms of their sort of own lived reality and politics is a very dangerous one, just because they're doing this play. So that you have to actually investigate your own homophobia, your own attitude, your own, this famous, this really common thing that when somebody's confronted about their homophobia, they say, oh, but I have 3 gay friends, and to really plumb deeper into those questions and say, but how do you show up for, like, if this is indeed your politics, how do you show up for it? And that's why those debates also happen within the play, where Adil's expectation for Partho is like, if you're a queer man, why aren't you at the Pride March? But also negotiating his college mates who he knows are queer, but cannot bring themselves to be open because and perversely participate in homophobic acts because that's the way of hiding their sexuality. So all of these spaces were lived experiences that I think the play had to kind of delve into. And again, I don't think the play kind of then makes any sort of final remarks or final statements. And it really runs with the messiness and the untidiness to the end, so much so that I still don't know if the ending of Still Moving is tragic or an unhappy happy ending. And I often talk about it with the actors who perform the play, and on different nights we feel differently. And yeah, so essentially, those are the two spaces, the spaces of messiness and doubt from which this play came up. They are still the spaces that I occupy, I think, as a playwright, that I think are fascinating in terms of how one might kind of relate their lived reality, which to me is full of questions, full of doubt, and full of like uh, not being able to often make sense of what is going on. And that's what's so valuable about the space of fiction for me, because I think the space of fiction can take lived reality into a space where you can ask questions, and you don't have the kind of objective that, say, activism or journalism or academia has, which are all spaces that are trying to at least find sort of some kind of definite idea, some kind of conceptual solidity, some kind of social anchoring in terms of politics. And I think that fiction eludes a lot of these full stops, and therefore makes it a versatile space, a space where all of us in this room who have different lived realities can actually get together and make something, and not feel like imposters, because actually we're coming in with questions. We're not coming in because we're like, I have something to say, and so, listen to me. But rather, I am full of questions. I don't know. Something that I often say about social media is that I very rarely see a comment or a post that has these words: I don't know how I feel about this, or I don't know enough about this, I'll get back to you later. Nobody says that. Like, nobody is willing to show uncertainty, doubt, lack of knowledge. And I think fiction should be the space that does that, that says that I don't know, but this play is one way of trying to find out. And that's the last thing I'll say, and hand over to you, Apeksha.
Okay, so do folks in the room have questions and like burning responses that peeps want to add? Okay, so I'll continue, and then maybe it'll open up the space for the rest of us also. So when I was framing the note that I sent to Neel for like, okay, here's what the conversation is about, it got me thinking about, so this whole question of writing from lived reality and representation, because there is an ethics to it, of course, but at the same time there is also the messiness of which hat do I really wear, which is the identity that I can claim to speak from, because in my own being I occupy various identities. And so can I can I say that I always speak, for instance, as a woman, because maybe I also have other parts of me, other identities that I am as well, so I can't always claim the woman identity, or because I claim the woman identity, does that mean that I can speak for all women? So it's kind of like the messiness of identity itself. And for me, I find that very. And then I thought, okay, so but I could speak for myself, like I could speak from my own life. And interestingly enough, I was part of this Indian ensemble writing program, and in that, the play I was working on writing was very much drawing on my own lived reality. It was a story that I was writing about myself and something I have lived. And I realized that even then, that question of how much distance do I create between myself and the character I'm writing was always present. It was always like, okay, so do I want to write this person as myself? Do I want to write this friend who I'm writing about as himself or herself? Or do I want to mask them and, in a different light? Do I want to fictionalize them so that I'm not revealing too much? That question of like vulnerability. And I realized that even in that situation, even if I'm writing about myself as today, like I'm a different person from the one I was when the incident actually happened, right? So, I mean, can we ever really claim to say, oh, I am writing, this as this? I think that we're always writing as, fictionalizing characters who are not us in that present moment. And so I think that's why I also was curious to have Neel speak about, this idea of writing from the lived experience of someone you're not. Because I'm not even what I was 10 years ago, which is the time I'm writing the play about. So, there's obviously a difference. And if I claim to write as today, I'm not doing service to the real pressing questions that I had 10 years ago, which now I'm like, oh my god, just like don't ever let anybody know that those are my questions, that like it's not, I mean, there is still disservice done there. There is still a bit of inauthenticity or something, I don't know. So I mean, it's not really a question, but I think it's the direction in which I'd like to open up this conversation is that when one is writing, what happens when you create characters? Like, how much does one inevitably draw on what we know? How do you go about exploring lives that we don't know? I mean, research is a very uh, whatever kind of word, it thinks, you think, okay, you'll read 3 books and you figure it out. But of course, for a playwright, it's not that. It's much deeper. It's delving within, it's having conversation, it's so many things. So yeah, I'd like to hear more about your exploration with your characters and for Still and Still Moving, and exploring lives that weren't yours, and at what point did you draw on your own life to write these characters?
Yeah, so I mean, interestingly, I talked a little bit about how the similarities between me and Rishi, the son, in terms of him negotiating his confusion about sexuality as a teenager. But the other thing was that because the age gap between Partho and Adil was so critical in the story, it's changed. But at the time that I was writing it, I had been on both sides actually in my life. I had been with a much older person, and I had been with a much younger person. And so I was kind of, in some senses, trying to occupy both spaces. And I had this huge tussle while writing the play where I couldn't tell. In early drafts, I really couldn't tell whose position I was more sort of invested in. And this was a question that was being asked by my co-writers. So they would read they would read a draft and they would say that it seems that you are very much the voice of Partho. And then I would overcompensate in the next draft. And then suddenly it would be like, Partho seems really sort of hard and things like that. So I had to really kind of oscillate between my own lived experience of what it's like to be the older person or what it's like to be the younger person, negotiating that age difference, negotiating the things that one has to do, and the kind of intimacies that one is kind of demanding from the relationship. And I think that a lot of that tussle has ended up in the play. But two things happened that made me understand that lived reality only goes a certain way in terms of when you work in the space of fiction. One was like the first draft that I wrote of the play. I really tried very much to work off things that people who I knew who had been in queer relationships told me, and it became very sort of fragmented. And then I said, no, I have to have a kind of sequence and logic. And so I wrote a draft, which I then gave to a friend of mine who is a director and queer and a very sort of like well-read and well-versed sort of theater personality. And he read it, and he sort of really ripped apart the draft. He sent me an email, which if it was printed would have been at least like 40 pages. And literally every scene he kind of took apart, and he was like, why is this line there? And then suddenly in the middle, he wrote in bold, he said, Neel, it's page 37. Why aren't they having sex yet? You know? And this was such a massive note for me, because he subsequently was talking about, he said, you've almost written a like Victorian play, you know, where of a love that will not speak its name. And then suddenly I realized, that's when I really suddenly felt like an outsider. And I felt like, okay, I've been too conservative in trying to be too delicate about something that I don't know enough about. I've really gone the other side. I've tried to make a beautiful painting that people will look at and be like, oh my God, that's so sad. And so he really sort of pushed me. He said that you have to, in fact, he said the messiness is after, like, I think his literal words were, they have to fuck and then everything will kind of like, fall apart. And so that's kind of big shifts happen there. Like Adil and Partho get together much quicker. So that was one thing. And the second thing was that I wrote Still Moving for a friend of mine who actually in his lived experience is very similar to Partho. He has like a lot of like age, experience, life story, etc., etc. And I basically wrote the role for him, and then I gave it to him, and I said that you have to do it, because if you don't do it, I'm stuck. Like and then he took the script into the mountains and was reading it, and then he called me up one day and he said, I don't understand why Partho is in love with Adil. I just don't get it. Like, why is he so infatuated with this boy? I don't see it. I don't understand it. So I had spent like an hour then talking to him, saying, and obviously everything that I was using was from my lived experience. I was like, oh, he feels this way. And essentially I was recalling what when I was in a relationship where I was the older person, what was it that I was kind of in? And I was like, that's what he sees, that's what he feels. And I went on, and he was really not convinced at all. But he decided to do the play for whatever reason. And midway through our production, one day after rehearsal, he came to me and he was like, sometimes there is just love and you don't know why. It just exists. It's there between two people. And I was elated because I took it as his way of saying that I don't need that answer anymore. Because I mean, one of my learnings as a writer and a director is, if you go into the rehearsal with the pressure that as the playwright or as the director, you know everything, you are doomed. You're like, because, and so I understood that, okay, there is something in the space of the imagination of the actor, or eventually, in fact, in the space of the imagination of the audience, that will complete your story. So when at the end of the, and which is why I like messiness, because messiness is also incompleteness. And I feel like theater, unlike any other art form, embraces incompleteness in a really sort of wonderful, full way. Like, so much so that people, when if you've directed a play, if you've written a play and you interact with your audience afterwards, the most thrilling thing sometimes can be how two people who came together and sat next to each other and watched the same play have entirely different things to say about it. And I think that happens sometimes with Still Moving, where people identify with different characters, and so it does have that openness. It does have that mysteriousness about what these people are thinking. Like, why does Adil choose to leave at the moment that he does? And what happens? I mean, I think a really beautiful question, two questions that I find very beautiful for writers to invest in. The first is, how is such a thing possible? Whatever it is, whether it's an act of love, whether it's an act of power, to understand what makes something possible is more interesting than the act itself. Because then you really go into kind of what happens between people, where do they come from, like what are the coincidences and lines that have to kind of collide to bring two people into the same room, into the same moment, into the same love story. And so that question continuously sort of mesmerizes me, like, how is such a thing possible? And the second is more like the question that I often feel like I want the audience to leave with, is like, is, and this is the thing that I learned a lot from idolizing and reading Chekhov and his plays, is to say what happens to, is to think what happens to these people, you know. And if at the end of the play you're actually truly invested to think that, okay, what happens to Partho after the play ends? What happens to Adil? What happens to Rishi? I mean, that's the big curiosity for me, is how will that relationship evolve? Because it seems like yesterday when I listened to Still and Still Moving, and more when I read the play, I feel like that's the primary narrative. The primary narrative is this man arriving at a moment at the end of the play where he can tell his son what he's not been able to do for 15 years. And Adil then is the agent of that. He's the agent and so those are the, sorry, I was really, Apeksha, I really rambled on, I'm sorry. But those are the two questions that I feel as a writer I'm most engaged with. How is such a thing possible, and what happens to these people?
Okay, because I have things to say, of course, but others who want to say, respond, things, feels.
I'll just ask, like, it's not like a question, as in, yeah, but like, was the religion, as in, Adil, is Muslim, so was that religion, like, any factor while writing that character? Because I don't see much of like that coming in, except for his name and like the one time it's mentioned in its entirety. So, like, does that factor in, or did you want to, or did you like consciously choose to not engage with that side of his identity? Something that.
Thanks, Anjana. I mean, many people have asked me that question before. And I mean, to really be honest, the name of that character came from when I was in college in Delhi University in hostel. There used to be a boy who was my junior in first year whose name was exactly, his name was Adil Ghani Khan. So this is a real person, okay? Not queer, not like, but he was just a beautiful personality, you know? And like he's a person who I used to look at and I used to just wonder, like, what is this human being, you know? And I shouldn't say was, I'm sure he still is. I don't know him right now, but he was a really lovely person. And I was just intrigued by him. And he was very beautiful, both like aesthetically, but also like, just his energy was great. And when I was thinking of the character, his face kept popping up in my head. And so I just shamelessly like used his name, you know, and then the other thing is subconsciously, I think, because, you know, a lot of us at Writer's Block talked about how in a lot of contemporary plays, the standard stock character is Hindu man. You know, even in and I'm talking about like plays that are set in urban settings and things like that. It's just like you don't see kind of too many identities. And it's not just Muslim characters. You don't see Sikh characters. You don't see, sometimes you may see Christian characters if a play is set in a particular. And so kind of, I think that subconsciously was in everybody's head, because in all those plays that came out, you know, of that period, of that workshop, you had like an entire play that was kind of on the Anglo-Indian community in Bandra and Bombay. And so it was a very concerted effort to kind of include those voices. But now when I'm sort of confronted by a question, I feel like I may have done that subconsciously, but yeah, I didn't pursue that element. Like, and I remember thinking about it because it was mentioned by some people who read the first few drafts. And I felt, and I tried to write, like when Adil talks about his parents and his mother, and I tried to add some kind of elements there, and they just seemed very tokenistic. They seemed like it's very tokenistic for him to say, "Nay, I spoke to Ammi, and then she said this," you know. And I thought that, you know, it then just seems like it's underlining the choice that the writer has made, and again, I thought that can we have a Muslim character go through an entire play? And this is in response to Apeksha's question, and not be seen as a Muslim, but a young gay man, you know, and I don't know, maybe that kind of, maybe that doesn't sort of pursue the whole kind of idea of having broadening the sort of diversity of representation in the play. But yeah, I decided that, and then it doesn't really sort of show up anywhere else in terms of yeah, the rest of the play.
So there's something I've been thinking about in terms of this thing about identities and writing, and as an actor, writer, director, I feel like, acting a certain identity is a different level of sort of speaking for than writing a certain identity is a different level than directing for a certain identity, etc. All of these things. But I feel like something that you said, Neel, is really crucial in all of this, which is also the homosocial aspect of all of it, right? Because you have, overwhelmingly, we tend to watch art created by people similar to us, and in some ways we're trying to like create more boxes in these identity politics kind of perspective of identity. But the biggest identity in India is still overwhelmingly caste, and it is still overwhelmingly class. And like you said, frequently Hindu, overwhelmingly Hindu. So even if I'm going to watch a play that's a queer love story, or I'm going to watch a play that is an interreligious love story, or I'm going to watch a play that is a murder story, or whatever, if you had gone ahead with your first draft, it's still quite likely that the plays I choose to watch are written by people of similar social standing, similar educational background, similar caste standing, similar language, obviously, because I'm unlikely to find a Tamil play in Bombay, and I'm unlikely to go for a Gujarati play in Bombay, even if I might understand a decent amount. And again, then follows the question, should people who don't have those identities write those identities? Sure, very valid question that I'm still trying to find where I stand on, and it changes depending on the time of day and what was the latest thing I've read and watched or seen. But the other thing is also, if we only engage with people writing from our same location, social location, and those people are only writing of people in the same social location, are we ever really engaging with people outside that location? Are we only going to have then Muslim characters who say Janab to everybody? None of my Muslim friends have called me Jana ever, like Meghana Jan ever, unfortunately. None of them wear like 3 meters of kajal under their eyes. But every Muslim character in a film seems to want to do that. Larry, I don't know, you're doing it wrong. I know your name is Muhammad, you're failing. Where's the surma? But but yeah, so I think that's also something to think about, because representation is not enough. That it's like that argument where people are like, oh, the head of the CIA is finally a woman. Like, okay, congratulations. So the person bombing weddings in Afghanistan is now a woman. Yay, win for feminism. Like, it's not. So representation has to be detailed and layered, and it can't be simplified down to what you identify as and you only engaging with that identity. That being said, etc., etc. I think I explained it. Sorry.
No, you're right. You're right, Meghna. It's incredibly complex. One of my fellow writers at Writer's Block is a brilliant Marathi playwright. I think he's my favorite playwright in India. His name is Dharma Kirti. I think some of his plays may be on the drama library, maybe. I hope so. He contacted me a few years ago, and we'd been, since we met in Writer's Block, we'd been meaning to work together for years. And he's been trying to convince me to direct a Marathi play. And I'm like, I don't speak the language. I don't know how is such a thing possible. I know there are directors who directed languages they don't speak, but to me, it seems like a huge like. And yeah, his name is Dharmakirti Sumant. Yeah, that's right. He's fantastic. I don't know how many of his plays are available in translation, but he used to work primarily with a company called Natak Company in Pune. So Dharmakirti wanted to write a story. I don't know if I should be telling this because I'm speaking on his behalf, but he wanted to write a story that was very, at its center had this kind of Dalit character that was, and sort of negotiating. And then he said that all his friends, all his Dalit friends and all his, even his kind of very progressive uh, sort of intellectual friends were like, don't do it. Just don't do it. Like, you are not the right person to do it. And we understand you. He kept saying this. And I also felt this anxiety. I said, first of all, I'm going to be working in a language that I don't understand. Then I'm going to direct like a play that, we had this long, very sort of tortuous discussion, again, full of doubt. And at that moment, I kind of understood some of the point that you were making, that it's, but from the other side, which is that, yes, one wants to be able to work across those lines and tell stories across those lines. But which lines are more tenuous? Which lines are more delicate? Being kind of a certain class and the gender that I am, and working primarily in English Hindi, I think a lot has changed in the last years. It's not just kind of the way kind of cultural politics or work politics has developed. It's also following kind of the Me Too movement and everything. You just want to tell a kind of cis, hetero, upper class man to shut up and listen, And that's what most of us should be doing most of the time. But how can one also write within that atmosphere? Like, how does one kind of, if you're a writer or if you're a director, which means that you have to speak in some ways, how can that kind of, how can the vocabulary change? And what are the things that you are actually, lines that you can actually engage with and move forward with, and not be tokenistic? Because there are people who are like, I want to show you how progressive I am. So in this play, I will have these characters. In this play, I will engage with that politics. And in that play, I will do that. And I think that that's also deeply problematic, because, I mean, are you ticking boxes? Are you trying to kind of make yourself seen with a certain kind of socio-political legitimacy? And it's all really, I mean, it's also depending on who you're having a conversation with, like who you're engaging with. So I think that I don't think there's any easy perspective on this. I think that and eventually I really find that, how does the work make you feel? Like, because the moment we singularize the writer or the actor or the director, we have forgotten, we have moved away from the piece of work, and are addressing the person, the man. And this is also that big debate of like, do you kind of, the artist and the artist's work. But I think it's particularly significant where, if the work makes you uncomfortable, and if the work seems disingenuous to you, if the work is problematic, then you have to challenge the work. And in challenging the work, you're also challenging the writer or the director or the performers. But what happens often is we challenge the legitimacy of the individual. So the art or the piece of work doesn't even come into the conversation. I mean, I saw a lot of this with, for example, the Kashmir files. I haven't seen the film, so I have no position on it. But when I read articles, there was so much talk about the director and who he is and what he stands for, versus the material that was genuinely like looking at the film and saying that, okay, why does this film make me uncomfortable, or why am I moved by this film? And those are two completely separate conversations, because one is a conversation of often about, I don't like this person, or so I am not going to engage. And the other conversation is, what is the work trying to do? Like, what is it doing to me? How am I responding to the story or the politics? And I think that those are very sort of murky negotiations that all of us have to make individually. Yeah.
Preeti, go for it.
out that what Apeksha said about each of one of us having multiple identities, and also what Meghna was saying about the tokenism or everybody saying Janab, and what you said about just giving a person a name. And I've heard you say this before, of leaving the audience with the interpretation, what you were talking about, that they come in with their own perspective. So just that name, I think when I saw the play, evoked so much more in my head. Like in my head, it was like, oh, it must be so much more difficult for Adil to negotiate this just because of the name. So I think when an audience watches it, something as tiny as a name or something else, even a symbolism of some sort, can evoke our own interpretation of what their lives might be like. So I think that angle also comes into play, I feel.
Yeah, just in response to that, Preeti, I realized something. I recently, just before the pandemic, I started working very actively with a theatre company in Delhi, which is called Agaz. And Agaz is a company that is essentially composed of young actors who are from the Nizamuddin Basti and have grown up together as a theatre company. And I directed them in a show. And often at the end of the show, we would have, and it's a show that, yes, does kind of come from their identity, not just as Muslims, but as a community that lives together and works together, but also kind of a community that was at that time staring down at the CAA and NRC laws. And this play is a very light play. I mean, even though the subject of the play is a group of young people are trying to find a new country to live in, and they can't decide on what kind of country, so they keep arguing about it. But at the end, I would often have a few people who came to me and said that, we missed the inner pathos of the young kind of Muslim identity. And this remark used to bother me so much, because the members of Agaz, and it alerted me that people have a certain expectation from a Muslim actor, from a Muslim character. And again, it's a question of what they see as a legitimate or the expected narrative. And when they're presented with something different, they feel like something has happened, a dilution, a kind of a cleaning up, a whitewashing of something. And I found it very difficult to explain to them, because again, who am I to talk on behalf of, I've directed them in a show, but to say that, oh, you're wrong about them. But I took this feedback back to the repertory, and they were just baffled by it. They were like, and one of them very innocently said, so then we can't play happy characters in plays. And I was like, I didn't know how to respond to that, but it's there, even for people who see themselves as incredibly sort of socially progressive in their head or woke, there is an expectation that comes, or a judgment that comes very specifically from how you read social politics, or what your expectation is from a situation. And I was that was a big learning for me, like in terms of that you will be seen as something, whether you like it or not, as a writer, as an actor, as a director, as a character.
If anyone doesn't want to go, can I add something? So I think just responding to all of these, right? About the current thing, I think it's more about, if I'm mentioning this, is because I'm coming to what I'm saying and I'm articulating it as I'm going, like my thing. About the particular thing that Preeti talked about, I think it's more of like an upper class gaze, where the oppressors just being like, yeah, we want to, as in, yes, like to see poverty, to see the pain, because that's how we think that's their reality. And and that's the same with queer people on screen, or like certain characters who are from a certain community on screen, where we want them to be a certain stereotype. And if they deviate from that, it's like, oh, but that's not how it is. But that's more of like I think more of a distant gaze. And that is not what, when I also, especially like I was thinking yesterday, a lot of these things and like mulling over it, and too many things, like my own sort of prejudices or whatever is coming into me perceiving a certain play, etc. So I think mainly as a writer, as an actor, as a theatre maker, or whatever you want to call it, my struggle is basically from the fact that there are real political, like there are systems of oppression in place where certain communities are have to bear the consequences of a written word or a statement or a piece of art. I can with my caste privilege, I can with my sort of support from whatever people around me, go on and make art in terms of like, okay, yes, I'm exploring this. I can sit with my doubt, I can sit with my discomfort, as long as I'm like, I can sit in a room where like filled with like queer people, mostly upper caste, upper caste, and say that like, yeah, I'm a queer person, this is what like this is and what blah blah blah. And then but then what? There are no real consequences for me. I have led a very sheltered life. Even so, even if I am queer, like my experience is very different to what my friends have gone through or what their lived realities is, or someone who comes from a different religion who is not the majority religion of this country. So then it's about that, right? Then it becomes about that. It's not my guilt or my shame, or not about like, oh, I can't write about these people. No, it's not about that. And usually like there is this thing which I say that like people don't want to write about people as people. So there is also that. So it's not just about like the identity or anything like that. We just stop writing about things as human beings and more like of labels and like, I'm not going there as well, right? I'm not going there as well. But it's just something just like I'm sitting with, because I can't. Something you said about Adil, the name and the person. I'm someone who loves Urdu dearly, and I read a lot and I want to learn. I love names, Urdu names. And I'm just infatuated, but like not a fetishization, don't worry. Like, but just I love it. I love it. And something, it just naturally comes whenever I'm writing. Suddenly like the character has a Urdu name, and then I'm like thinking, I'm just stopping, like what are the repercussions of this, right? Like what am I doing with this? So it's more like, and also I don't come from a lot of experience. I'm someone who started writing, so then like to sort of even navigate that would be like, I'm just saying it's just more difficult for me. I'm sorry, I'm going all over the place, but I hopefully you are trying, like you're understanding what I'm trying to say, all of you actually. So I think it's mainly that like all these things that I'm exploring or I'm talking about, or my whole tryst with this and me writing about this has actual political repression, consequences in place. And there are societies or there are communities which are oppressed, and their reality doesn't change. It might get worse. In the case of Kashmir Files, it has gotten worse. It has gotten 100 to 200 times worse. So yeah, so what do you do, especially like with caste? Especially with caste, that's something which I've been struggling with for the past 2 years, a lot more than I used to be conflicted with that. So I can't just like up and write about it. That's just a no-go in my, like as at my ethics as a writer, it's just a no-go. I do not do that. I do not cross over to that. Queer people, this people, that people, okay, fine, whatever. But like, I don't go over to the zone of like caste. That's a personal rule that I follow. So then it's about that. So that's where I'm coming from. Like, what do you then, how do you sort of negotiate that in your personal, like, I mean, yes, it's an individual question. It's like you have to sit with that, you have to go through that. But then if we are seeing all of this, right, if we are taking in all of these perspectives, and I'm also guessing that most of us who are talking about this is also from like an upper caste locations. So then what about that is my question.
Neel, can I just intervene a little bit? I think that I relate a lot to these questions, and I think for me, the way I'd like to frame this question to you is just how does a writer bear these contradictions? Because I think that these contradictions are kind of inherent to the process of making any art. No, any social reality that you will want to engage with, you will have to engage with its contradictions, and so this is very much a part of that. And I definitely do recognize that, you know, the whole cliche is true that writing is sometimes a very lonely place in which you have to kind of bear it all by yourself and, you know, sort of manage these really gushing, overwhelming, you know, where you feel terrible about yourself and you feel like, oh my god, am I a terrible person to want to write this? But then at the same time, oh, I'm really curious and I do want to engage and I do want to ask these questions. And I think what you said, for me has really, I mean, it has really hit home, that this idea of this question that a writer must ask, like, how is this happening? Like, how is this possible? You know, and I've been thinking about that all day today because I've been reading about Roe v. Wade, and I've been thinking, like, how is it possible that there is a bunch of people that have made this happen in this world? Like, yes, it's terrible, but how? Like, how is it possible that Tisa Setalvad is in jail right now? You know, how is it possible that these things have happened? And I think that asking that how is it possible question pushes you in these uncomfortable territories. You know, it pushes you to, in a way, also even understand it from the other point of view. You might not agree with it, you may not condone it, but you have to understand it. You have to understand why it is happening, you know, what has led to that happening in that way. And I find it even like really useful as what, so there's something that politics contributes to art, but this is, I also feel like what art contributes to politics is like, so how do you go deeper into that question? And so from that point of view, I'm saying this is a really important work that a writer does. And how do you, in your own journey, bear it? What are your experiences with it?
This is kind of a heavy question because I'm full of a lot of the anxiety and doubt that Anjana has. I mean, even, you know, I sort of 15, 17 years into a theater career as a playwright and a director. And the only thing that I know with a little more clarity now, which I may have been a little bit naive about earlier, because I think a lot of us start out in the theater writing and directing, wanting to make work that will change something. You know, this phrase that, oh, I want something in the audience's mind to change by the end of the play. I want to affect something. I want to solve something. And I think that the movement into the space of doubt then immediately sort of cancels that objective, because you actually have nothing to impart. You have nothing to solve. But who the hell are you to solve anything in the first place? And I think that sort of addressing both what Anjana was saying and what you're saying is, I think that you just have to decide as a writer, which is why what you want to do. I mean, what is it that you're seeking to do? Which is why in rehearsals and in ideating about plays, the shift that I made at some point from thinking, what is this about, to what is this trying to do, was huge for me. Because what is it about means that you're crystallizing a play, an idea, an initiative into one thing, you know, into something definite. And then the thing is that then when you present it in front of an audience, they either see that thing or they don't. You know, often like when we've been younger, and some people when they've been older as well, will kind of present a piece of work, and then there'll be a certain response to the work. And then the writer or the director will say, oh, the audience didn't get it, or they didn't get it. And the problem is not that they didn't get it. The problem is that there was an it, you know, which is something so specific. And if they didn't see it, maybe it wasn't there, you know, if they didn't get it. And I often felt like to say this play is about this, then means that the audience either accepts that or they reject that, or they see it or they don't see it. But when you say this play is trying to do something, you're already in the space of questions. And then the thing is it can't do it on its own. It has to do it with the text, with the performance, with the audience. And which is why two people can come out of a play and have completely different opinions about it. And because the play is trying to do that, the play is trying to engage, and the play is offering you that space to complete. And I think that Howard Barker has a great essay where he talks about like why the idea of the theater that has a conscience is so problematic, is because then the writer's always assuming a social, political, and moral position above the audience, where I have to teach you something, I have to convince you. And when it comes to these identity politics, it's impossible to resolve, right? Because we live in a kind of context that, as Anjana has pointed out, has so many layers, and you only occupy some of those layers and some of those spaces, that you can't even begin to fathom what's going on somewhere else. So, Anjana, when you say I've drawn a line, it's because you understand that that's not a space you can go into. And I mean, I'm assuming, sorry, I don't speak on your behalf, but that's not a space that you feel like you have legitimately something to be able to do or say or something like that. And I feel that similarly about like caste politics, is that I just feel like I need to know a lot more. And I feel like as somebody in my position, I need to be listening. And sorry, yeah.
No, just to add to that, it's not about like I don't have things to say, but I think I would rather talk about it to the oppressors, like my upper caste Savarna fellows,
Yeah.
and like talk about that experience, because that's my location and that's where I should be doing the work, than
Yeah.
like taking up space from like other people who have had that experience. So it's more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just in relation to that, the other thing that we have to all of us acknowledge in this room, in the theaters that we perform in the spaces that we occupy, in the conversations that we occupy, is what those spaces actually are. Because those spaces in themselves also are defined by who has access to them and things like that. So where you perform, who you're performing for. And that also again comes into this question that what are you trying to do? Like, I can't do Still and Still Moving and pretend like it's a play that is going and spreading its and kind of self amongst the queer community. Which queer community? The queer community itself has kind of so who is it addressing? I know that my play is going to be performed in venues where people of a certain background context are going to come, and so I have to both kind of wrestle with that but acknowledge that I can't be. I mean, I think it's naive to think that a lot of people in the theater now feel like I want to move beyond my context. I have to move beyond my context. I have to do work that's in other contexts. But you have to always know that you are coming from that context. You can't just, it's not a sort of cloak that you can take off and say, oh, now I'm one with another context. And I think that this is always, in response to Apeksha's question, this is always a negotiation. Whatever piece of work you start, and when you make it, and after it's done, and when people are talking about it, like I'm talking about Still and Still Moving, and I haven't actually done a show of the play in 5 years, and so it's kind of, and we're talking about it in a different time, but and that's what's really amazing to me about theater, is that if people continue to talk, then the place, then what you're trying to do has a life beyond the curtain call. But if a play is about something, then we can always just debate that, and we're either agreeing or we're disagreeing, and it comes back again to that whole statement and question thing. It's the principal reason I was excited by this conversation, because I think this conversation is asking a question about the experience of writing the play, as opposed to trying to debate like what is Still and Still Moving about. Does it achieve that? Does it not achieve that? But what is the conversation that we're having after yesterday's reading? And I think that's very kind of interesting to me. Yeah.
Okay, I think Meghna has a question. I also just want to flag, Ayush also has a question, that officially we will close at 5:30. So let's take Meghna and Ayush's question and Neel's final comments, and then maybe we can hang around if Neel is wishing to spend more time with us. Cool. Okay, Meghna, and then
It's not a question, but it's in response to something that Neel and Anjana both said about these anxieties about wanting to create change. And yeah, it's definitely crippling for some of us. And I'm reading this book right now by Anne Bogart, and she's this director from New York, and overwhelmingly tends to have political theater and opera also. And I've just finished reading the second chapter or something. I've hardly gotten into it, but she said something that I'm on reading just gave me a lot of peace. I need to finish reading the book and then reread it 2 or 3 times before it gives me a little bit more peace. But it says that she always thought that the mark of good theater or art in general was it stayed with the audience afterwards, and it stayed and remained with the audience, and that was when it was creating change. Not even if it changed their mind, but even if it just remained in their mind for them to debate about later, that was successful for her. And now over the course of the pandemic, she started thinking of it in a new light, which was what did it do to the audience while they were there, while they were experiencing it? Did it create resonance in them? And that is a meter of success, because as she says, I read plays and I move on, and I often forget what the play is about. Like when Neil said in the beginning he's very affected by Chekhov, I was like, yeah, I've read something by Chekhov. What did I read? I read Seagulls. What's it about? I don't know. I don't remember. I genuinely don't. That doesn't mean it's an ineffective play. But did it do something to me while I was reading it? Yeah, sure. It made me think things. It made me think thoughts for the rest of that day, or maybe the next day or the day after that. And I'm trying to convince myself that I've set a standard for myself that I cannot reach, which is what is giving me this crippling anxiety, that I cannot create change. I am just a person, and I might hope that I might be the butterfly that creates the hurricane in Hawaii, but I'm possibly not. So yeah, I just wanted to share that potentially hopeful thought.
I'm so sorry, but I have to add, it's just one sentence, it's not going to take much time. Just want to clarify because it just came up a lot, like after what I said. I am not seeking or wanting to change anything. That's not where my politics or my practice comes from. That's assuming a lot of power, which I try to stay away from. So, yes, like, no, not at all. That is not where I'm coming from. I don't want to make any change with my theater. I don't want to do anything. I would just love it if I can just make justice, like write actually things which can do justice to my own emotions, which I sometimes not end up doing because like I cannot relate most of with what I write. So I'm like, what are you doing? So it's just about that for me, and the conversations which can be created after that, and the critique that I can like possibly get and connect with more people, etc., etc. But I'm not seeking to change anything. I don't want to. That's just another thing like all together is what I just want to point out. It's very important for me. That's why I just pointed out. Yeah.
I don't think any of us were like. I mean, just to speak for. Okay, let me speak for my. I didn't get that from you. Like, I didn't get that you was. That's what you were saying. I think the word change came up because I think, and also you expressed yourself very differently from people who make theater that they think is going to make a certain change. Like, they don't speak with anxiety at all. I think that they speak with a lot of kind of confidence. Yeah, and and so I didn't get that from you at all. But anyway, thanks for clarifying that.
No, the change was there, so I was just like a lot of it was just there. So I was just like, okay, did I say something? Because I'm very scattered anyway. Like you said, I'm very anxious. So yeah.
Which is an entirely good place to be. I'm saying, Anjana, like anxiety is like a kind of slightly more intense version of doubt. So I think that you're on the right track. But I just want to, in response to what Meghna said, there's another theater director, again, also opera director, called Peter Sellars, who came to India once, and I was a very sort of, I knew about him. I had kind of read about his work. So I had this big fanboy moment where I sat in front of him and I was like, so Mr. Sellers, what is theater about for you? And the moment I said, I regretted it. It sounded like such a stupid question, but his answer was so beautiful. His answer was that, two people will go to see a play, say, Apeksha and Falguni go to see a play, and then they come out of the play and they talk about what they felt, and maybe they have an argument, and then the next day kind of Falguni will go and meet Preeti and she'll say, oh, I went to see a play with Apeksha and she felt this and I felt this and this happened, and this is what it evoked in me. And Preeti will next day go meet Ayush, and she said, Falguni and Apeksha went to see a play, and they had this argument. And then Apeksha told me, Falguni told me this. And what do you think about that? And he said the miracle of that and the beauty of that is 3 days after the play, 2 people are talking who haven't seen the play but are having a conversation about the play. And he said that if theater can do that, whether it's whether it's happy theater, sad theater, political theater, farcical theater, then something is going on. And Meghna used the word resonance. And that's really that's what you always want. You want that kind of resonance, whatever it is, like whatever feelings and emotions and anxieties and questions and thoughts that it holds. You want to share it with people, because like real tension, the more you spread it out, the more whatever, you know what I'm saying. Sorry, Ayush, I interrupted you.
I want to ask, can I? Hello,
Very light.
is it clear now? Yeah. Can I ask in Hindi? Does everybody understand Hindi? मुझे ये पूछना था कि मेरे साथ क्या हुआ था कि इंग्लिश ऑनर्स में दिस अलग अलग प्ले राइट्स में पढ़ाते हैं, देयर इज अ सब्जेक्ट मॉडर्न इंडियन ड्रामा, और उसमें आई रिमेम्बर द लास्ट यूनिट हमें गिरीश कर्नाड पढ़ा रहे थे, एंड उसके बाद हमारे प्रोफेसर ने पूरे उससे कह दिया कि गिरीश कर्नाड के बाद कोई अच्छा इंग्लिश प्ले राइट आया ही नहीं। एंड मैं उस टाइम पे मैंने स्टिल मूवी पढ़ रखा था और मैं बहुत कुछ पढ़ रहा था उस टाइम पे, मैं शॉक हो गया, सर आपने नील चौधरी नहीं पढ़ा सर? तो वो हुआ, और फिर एवरीवन वाज एंजॉयिंग इट कि सेकंड ईयर का बच्चा प्रोफेसर को बोल रहा है। एंड आफ्टर ऑल दैट ही सेड कि यू कम टू मी आफ्टर 10 years व्हेन दोस प्लेस व्हिच यू आर टॉकिंग अबाउट, व्हिच यू लाइक, मैं कह रहा था कि आपने नील चौधरी नहीं पढ़ा, तो दोस प्लेस विल स्टैंड द टेस्ट ऑफ टाइम, कि they will be relevant after 10 years and तो कि they will be relevant after 10 years, और 10 साल के बाद जब लोग उनको पढ़ रहे होंगे तो मे बी तब तुम्हारे करिकुलम में भी वो आ जाएगा, फिर तुम 10 साल बाद वापस इंग्लिश ऑनर्स करना है सर। एंड वही मेरे दिमाग में चल रहा था कि एज अ फॉर्म थिएटर, बिकॉज एंड ऑल्सो एक सर्टेन फॉर्म ऑफ एक ऑडियंस देख पाते हैं उसे, जिनके पास शायद पैसे हैं, टिकट्स खरीद सकते हैं वो सब, तो एक ऑडिटोरियम में कुछ लोग बैठ सकते हैं, एक परफॉर्मेंस स्पेस में कुछ लोग बैठ सकते हैं, एक फाइनाइट नंबर ऑफ शोज कर सकता है एक परफॉर्मेंस, और देन आई फेल्ट कि मे बी अ स्क्रिप्ट इज द बेस्ट वे मे बी, एंड ऑल्सो अभी जो डॉक्यूमेंटेशन आजकल हो रहा है बहुत ज्यादा प्लेस पर, बट a script is the best form of maybe to make the play timeless. मैं आज टेक चेक ऑफ कर सकता हूँ जो 40s में लिखा था यार, मैं वो कर सकता हूँ। वही मेरे को पूछना था कि do you feel अभी आपकी प्रैक्टिस में कि how do I make this timeless? ये कभी क्वेश्चन आता है दिमाग में, या फिर while in your practice की ये क्या रेलेवेंट रहेगा मतलब मेरे जाने के बाद, या फिर आगे लोग देखेंगे इसको।
Yeah, I mean, this very rarely goes through my mind, honestly, because I think I'm still stuck on, will this make sense now? I don't even know what 10 years later is going to look like. I mean, one of the big differences is the further we've gone into modernity and postmodernity and contemporary times, plays have started to date themselves much more specifically. So, for example, to me, Chekhov is still intact. Chekhov wrote in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But if you read his plays, it's miraculous. He's talking about climate change. He's talking about the crumbling environment. He's talking about kind of social disintegration of families. He's talking about the death of theater in Seagull. And all of that is so relevant right now. Like, you read it and it could be, he wrote in 1895 or whatever, it could be 2022. Like I just recently directed a version of The Seagull, and we adapted it to 2020, and we had to change very little. And similarly, people who work with mythic structures, because we're talking about Karnad, Havadan will age very well. Some of its sexual politics, maybe not, but in terms of it being a play that kind of addressed a political emergency and things like that, it will age well. But whereas I think that a lot of the work that I do, like Still and Still Moving, has already aged, because 377, that has changed, unless again it gets repealed. Who knows what will happen in the next 5 years, but it's already aged. A lot of the things that were delicate about it, for example, the building of the Delhi metro. Now the metro has become so commonplace in Delhi that the wonder about this new thing that had entered the city, so is aged. Abhishek Majumdar's plays about Kashmir are about very specific kind of contexts of Kashmir, which have also changed dramatically in the last 5-7 years. So politically, plays that deal with a kind of social realism, I think, will age. But maybe it's the craft. I think it's the craft that you hope will endure. But even there, I have big doubts, Ayush, because मुझे लग रहा है कि the theater itself is changing really rapidly. Like the way the stage was seen in the 60s and 70s when Tendulkar and Karnad and all of them worked is changed now. Like, what is theater right now? You can't really define it as a specific thing. What somebody, the lines between theater and performance art and dance have really sort of smudged. And so to kind of define something as, and actually that's also the thing is, very few people, and this is, I'm going to very strategically turn this into a way to promote drama library. But very few people read plays these days. Like, where's the access? Go into a bookshop. You'll see like maybe one corner of one shelf is reserved for theater, and it'll just be, it'll be what you expect. It'll be Shakespeare and Chekhov and some Indian plays. And yeah, the books are very expensive. And which is why many writers in working right now have chosen a much more democratic thing, which is to just like email me, I will send you the play. Like forget royalties and intellectual rights and all. That's another system that you keep track of that and get your 20 rupees every time a show is done is impossible. So so I think that because of the democratization of the play as a text also, I don't know. Like, I really don't know who's going to be reading Still and Still Moving in 2030. I don't know. That's not a slight on the play. I just don't know what kind of context we'll be in and how that will happen. So yeah, that's my feeling. But I have the same. I mean, obviously, I have a vested interest in this. But this where a lot of people say there's no great writer after Karnad, and not because I'm like presenting myself and saying, hey, what about me? It's because I just feel like there is, I've heard Nasiruddin Shah say this also, there are no people writing. And I think also part of this comes from an ignorance that a certain generation has of a certain kind of work that exists in India. I mean, I think a lot of those people would be surprised to know that there are 200 plays up on this archive right now. By working playwrights, people who kind of write and produce their work often. It's not just I wrote one play one day when I felt like it.
Okay. Shreyan, I know you have a question, but I also have Falguni looking at me. Can we allow one more question, or should we just...
Yeah, no, we can do that. And I mean, even after the formal end, like we'll just stop the recording. So after that, we can have like a water cooler chat, like informal thing. It's fine for whoever wants to stay behind.
In your question being part of the official recording. Cool. So should we close it officially and then Neel, you hang around and Shreyan can go with his question? Okay. Thank you all for being around. I mean, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that those listening to the official recording at this point are feeling like, oh my god, I really wanted to know what Shreya's question was, and too bad, you can join the next conversation or something like that. And yeah, thank you all. And Falguni, you're good to go. Okay, Shreyan, go for it.